Hello, everybody. Hello, HubSpot users, marketers, webinar gurus, webinar experts. I'm super excited to have Luuk here with me today. Luuk, how are you?
I'm great, thanks. Excited to be here.
Yeah. To those who might not know Luuk, he's one of the co-founders and head of product at Contrast, a webinar platform. So I thought, with how the whole landscape of brand building and nurturing context and everything is changing, webinars are definitely something that will stay and it will be more and more important. And if we talk about individualization of communication and better communication with people, yes, we should talk about webinars. So yeah, Luuk, I'm super excited to have you. Um, as a first thought to start with, you at Converse are talking about webinars not being kind of a broadcast tool, but more of a data engine to fuel everything further for a company. Can you just walk us through your kind of point of view on webinars and the real value in the world today and the days to come?
hmm Yeah, I think if you look back at the history of webinars, what people wanted to do, and that was also a limitation of technology, is they just wanted to get their message out there, right? And that was great. But things have changed. We want to build community, we want to interact, especially since COVID. And unfortunately, many of the webinar platforms that people use today, they have been built before COVID. So what they do is they allow you to stream a video, give a presentation, just like in a real office, but over the internet. I think that used to work, but you can see that it's no longer working because more and more people are saying webinars are that. I completely disagree with that. I think many of my colleagues would disagree with that. Um, but things have to change, and that is I think twofold. That change, that is, people have to change. People don't want to watch a webinar that is just a presentation, or better even, it's just a sales demo.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, people are busy, right? So they're not going to tune into your 30-minute, even worse, 1 hour pitch deck about how you do whatever. And then two, they want to interact. They want to understand, okay, who are the people behind that brand? And I think we can touch upon that later, but I think with the coming of AI, or it's already here, this is only going to be more and more important.
Mm-hmm. Maybe before we go, yeah, into further, how the importance of webinar, how pros are doing it. How do you think about on-demand recordings of something and live webinars where people can really interact with you in the right way, where you can interact and then kind of understand who the audience is, so you can maybe focus on specific topics and areas. How do you see all that?
Truth is, more and more people watch on-demand webinars.
Hmm.
I wish it was different, especially for the people organizing a webinar. There's nothing as terrible as organizing a webinar, getting 500 people to sign up, and then only seeing, I don't know, 50 people come to the webinar. But the reality of things is that people are super, super busy, and they also know that most of the webinars these days are being recorded. So you have to offer that option. But I think in general, people should try and optimize for that live moment, because that is what creates the engagement, right?
Mhm.
That is what creates that two-way street between the people viewing the webinar, and also hosting the webinar. Ultimately, that is what builds trust. That is what creates better content, because there's nothing better than a webinar that is essentially 60 minutes of questions, I think.
Yeah.
But then also the data that generates is far more valuable than on demand. So what I wish that people would be doing more is find new and innovative ways to get people to come to the live webinar.
Do you see any pro tips for those who are
Um,
organizing webinars, how to increase that kind of conversion from registrant to attendee?
uh, there's cheap tricks that work. I'm thinking of giveaways. They do work. Famous speakers, they do work, but they only do work to get people actually to come to the webinar. I think if you really go down to the essence of a great webinar, that is having a topic that resonates with people. And then it should not be the content that people can find using ChatGPT, Google, whatever. It should really give something to the people watching the webinar that they could normally not obtain. And most of that magic is happening, of course, on the registration page and the content distribution strategy that you build around that in order to create that feeling, okay, I have to be there at that webinar. That is one that I see working. Number two that I see working is great communities. Many, or I think many people wish they had a great community. The reality is they don't. But there are a few customers that we also have where actually the entire community comes together during a live webinar. And that is, I think, amazing. So it's really like a sort of get together online. And that is great as well for, again, engagement, getting people to come live.
More than an ex cathedra pitch of something, but rather, yeah, a live communication.
Exactly.
People sharing the same kind of passion on the topic.
Yeah.
That's an interesting insight. From what you see, what are kind of the data points, going back to the data generation, driving kind of vehicle as a webinar? What kind of data do you see you can capture and others are not, and are then the gold that you kind of get from the webinar if you do it in the right way?
I think it is, as an industry, we need to move towards anything that somebody does on a webinar platform, being an attendee, that needs to become a data point. Luckily, the competitors are not as advanced in this as maybe we are. But essentially, what I want to know is, I want to know, did people register? Obvious, right? I want to know, did they watch it live or on demand? Logical. Most webinar platforms have these data points. But would I treat John the same way if they had watched 5 minutes of my webinar versus 60 minutes of the webinar? Probably not. So that's an interesting data point. And then I want to understand, what is it actually that they did while they were there during the webinar? Were they just passively watching, which is okay? Maybe they asked a question, right? I want to know what that question was, especially if I'm the salesperson and that's my prospect. I want to know what they are asking. What did they answer during a poll, right? We love to run the poll, what CRM are you using? Because it helps us qualify for the people that are using HubSpot. And essentially anything that the webinar platform offers as a feature, maybe CTAs, downloadables, I want to be able to see that in an easy and accessible way in HubSpot. I am mostly talking in this call about, of course, HubSpot, because we are building for HubSpot mostly. But essentially, yeah, it should be CRM agnostic, I would say.
I would like to touch that point in a way. You're building for HubSpot. What exactly does it mean? How is your way of thinking, building a product, building the integration different because of that mindset?
In terms of go to market, or in terms of product, or maybe both?
Both in a way, because I think that, from what I see and how I think, the more you correctly, if I may use that word, integrate with one CRM, HubSpot in that particular case, the better use of everything you can bring, all the data you mentioned, how much someone watched it. If there's a seamless data flow between your platform and HubSpot, and then I can do a lot of post-webinar activities way more efficient if the data is there, if it's formatted in the right way, if it's seamlessly there, that I don't need to make sure that it's there. I can just test things in advance because I know data will be there.
Right. So when we started Contrast, we looked at the competition. We looked at the competitor that was nearest to us, that we heard most of people talk about during sales calls. And we looked at, okay, what are they doing terribly? And HubSpot was one of the things. So I wish it was a much more intelligent move, but it was as simple as that. So what we did from the very beginning is we looked, okay, we asked one of our marketeers, Maxime Paulsen. He had a lot of experience with HubSpot. He had experience with webinar data. And we told him, you're in charge of designing the best possible HubSpot integration that's going to give you data. Okay, that was our starting point, and then we worked together with a few customers in designing the best possible integration. What you do find out is that people always want more data, even though it's not helping them, right? Because if I give you 200 data points versus 50, everyone will ask for 200. But in reality, because there are so many data points, nobody will get started by using those data points. But what it allows us is it allows us to be super, super focused on just HubSpot, really understand how people use HubSpot, right? If you take an example of the way that HubSpot treats prospects and leads versus Salesforce, even that is already entirely different, right? Or entirely different is maybe too big, but it is different.
Different, yeah.
So what I like about just developing for HubSpot is it allows us to go really, really deep on the ways that people use HubSpot in order to make their webinars work for their business.
Mm-hmm. And I assume you also help, or at least consult, once the data is in, what are the best practices within HubSpot, how they should be using it, and how to make the most out of data you can bring to HubSpot for them.
Yeah, I think quite naively in the beginning, we thought we give people the data and our job is done, we can move on to the next customer. That's not the case. We give a lot of data to people. People ask for that data during sales conversations. But what we generally see is that once we have integrated contrast, even though it's just a one click with our integration, what you see is that people will not really use that data. And I think that is both a people problem and in some cases also a product education problem. So that is something that we are looking at heavily improving right now because we understand that, okay, in a lot of teams, there is simply not a HubSpot expert. They are marketing people, right? It's their job to get the data into HubSpot so that sales can act on it. And I think that is where a bit of the gap starts because sales is not happy because marketing only got the data into HubSpot but didn't make it usable. And marketing is like, oh, but it's my job to get more people into the CRM, and then there's nobody that takes that role actively.
And in your experience, who is then kind of taking the next step from one the data is in? I guess it depends. Is the best answer. Sometimes it might be marketing or the webinar responsible person. It can be HubSpot admin RevOps if they have one, or it can be someone from sales. I've seen any of those cases to be true for different companies. So I'm curious to to understand from your experience how that goes, and then how exactly they are then using that. I assume marketing team uses and treats data in a different way than a sales team would. Maybe now sales is using more for lead scoring. Marketing might be using that more for tailoring the messaging further on road. Really curious about that.
Yeah, so like you say, it really depends. What we typically see is if it's a small company, I don't know, 10 to 20 people marketing team, nobody's doing it unless there is a HubSpot champion. They know HubSpot in and out and they absolutely love using it. Otherwise, it's very often a difficult case. And I think this is where we need to step in as product people. We can talk about that in a minute as well. There are teams, we are talking to a few very big companies who have dedicated people about the CRM. Okay. Like you say, it really depends. What I typically do see though is that marketing is busy with, okay, we get the data in there, we make it accessible, and maybe there is some sort of lead scoring going on. But then again, we have to look back at what does the webinar platform deliver in terms of the data that you get, because that is instrumental what people ultimately do with the webinar data. A super concrete example maybe here is that you can have data available in HubSpot, but how do you make it available? One of our competitors, what they do is they say we have a native HubSpot integration, which technically on paper they do. But then when you connect HubSpot and you get the data in HubSpot, all of that engagement data is attached as a node. So yeah, you have the data in HubSpot, but is it usable? Not at all, you know? So it really, again, depends on how are you getting the data in HubSpot and how can you then use it. And then it comes down to, okay, how proficient are people with HubSpot? For example, we give all of that data as an activity timeline, which makes it visible to salespeople. And typically, salespeople just need to have visibility in the data in order for them to reach out to their prospect and say, hey, I saw you answer this and this during a poll question, right? But for marketing, let's say they want to build a campaign based on activity from the webinar, or how warm the lead is, and they then want to use webinar data in that. Well, firstly, the webinar platform needs to provide that data as a property, which almost nobody is doing. And then the marketing person needs to know how do they collect all of those properties, put that in a workflow that then creates a list that they can then use.
And this is probably to your previous point, where you as product team can jump in and really help make the use out of data, because I assume only with that they will really experience the benefits of contrast against any other webinar platform.
Yeah, 100%. And unfortunately, before it used to be quite complex to do this effectively in HubSpot, right? Because the way that we can display information in HubSpot is through our integration, but then only as an activity timeline, which is a little bit limiting in itself, I think, and properties. And the disadvantage of properties is, for example, you can only do what is most recent, right? If you say, okay, I want to get a list of all the webinars they attended, that is not possible in a property because you would need to create an infinite amount of properties, for example, that says they attended this webinar and this webinar. So you can only do something like the last webinar. What's interesting is that HubSpot is actively working at this problem. And quite recently, a few months ago, they released a new beta, which is called, I think, the UI components beta. And what it allows us to do as Contrast is literally pull data from Contrast without even going through the HubSpot integration. It's literally pulling data from our API, and we can display that using HubSpot's UI components, so their design system, to display data. So now what we can do is super interesting. We can simply display one card on top of a contact. We call it the Contrast engagement timeline. You see all of the webinars they've watched with a link to those webinars. You see whether they watched live or on replay, how much they watched, and then you just have to click on it and you see all of the engagement, poll answers, chat messages, etc. So I think it's really important that webinar platforms start working together with the CRM that they're developing for, in order to really get that data in HubSpot so that it's usable.
Yeah, and it will be more and more true in the era of AI. If that data is not correctly available to AI, there will be no way to know to use it further. Having that in a property is definitely useful for all the workflows, as you said. But if you have that correctly structured, and then all the historical data which you're now bringing to HubSpot, you can really use that for further understanding, classification of people with AI. I mean, if you're doing something good, you have a lot of people at the webinars, so you have a lot of data to kind of understand people's behavior and how to really narrow down your messaging to that concrete person, which is, as I see, it's really the important bit and piece. Even though for post webinar follow-up, if you know someone was asking something or answer something, you can relate to exactly that pain point that they expressed. And then it can make the huge difference sending, hey, those are the 10 highlights from our webinar, do whatever you want with that, but hey, I know you answered that on the webinar. This is these are the 2 highlights we talked about, and this is how we help you go about that as a next step. Let's talk.
Yeah, I think the way that the data is structured today is, of course, to make it as efficiently possible to use things like workflows, right? There's nothing worse for a software engineer to be using just a random string of data because they have no clue how to read it out, right? I need to apply a regex formula when somebody says, hey, my phone number is, versus having a phone number field.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, AI makes it super, super easy to do exactly that. Still a bit pricey, maybe, but that is just a question of time. So I think what we're going to find out is quite soon, as we're sitting, hopefully, on a gold mine of data that we were before not able to extract, and that we have before really narrowly like defined in, yeah, let's call it a phone number field, whatever. But there's so much contextual information lost. I'm thinking about the chat messages, right? That is something that AI inevitably is going to uncover.
Yeah. And that unstructured data is where AI can really play a huge role, leveraging that information. Uh, and on the other side, this is where people really express their thoughts and pain points, because they can just write and spit it out. Where, if you have 5 bullet points options, you are somewhat limited. You just pick the one that probably matches to what you think, but not necessarily. But yeah, before AI, in a way, it's much harder to manage that kind of information. Before we went live, you mentioned you're now starting to use Supert for everything. Just a teaser for everyone. You'll be talking about that in more detail tomorrow, right?
Yes, I think it's 5 p.m. CEST. I'm not exactly sure, but it's somewhere around that
Somewhere.
time.
Okay. Anyone who is interested can find out. Before we wrap up, webinar as a live video streaming compared to AI generating video content. How do you see all that, the importance of webinar in and kind of brand building through that channel in the days to come, where, as I see it, that video content is more and more important. How you can bring to the audience your personality, your real thoughts, and AI video generation will never catch up on that.
I think so. Um, we have AI at Contrast. We use AI. We have it in the product. We even had a time that we build our, I don't want to say our entire value proposition around it, but we had AI repurposing tools that people were looking for. So I think that will exist. But at the same time, I'm super, super bullish on AI in general, for the fact that I think it will actually make people want more human connections. In the beginning of this webinar, I said, okay, webinars are there to generate leads, like you said, but they're there also to build trust, right? People want to see the people behind a brand. I don't think that will ever disappear. As simple as that. Will AI help in that? For sure. But do I expect AI avatars to be running a webinar? Much less likely so. Ultimately, why people come to webinars, again, is for the content and unique knowledge that's captured in those webinars, and the people behind it, right? And for me, that is something that AI doesn't really replicate today. Maybe tomorrow, but we will probably see so much AI generated content that we're almost looking for that antidote, right? There's a reason that people go to the beach and they still bring a parasol. They love the sun, but all day that sun, that is
Yeah.
that's pretty brutal. So yeah, no, for me, I'm not afraid of AI. People have asked me if I'm afraid of AI as a webinar company. We see so many, companies today creating these AI avatars. Yeah, I welcome it. I think it's good for certain use cases. But for webinars, that community building, that trust building, I simply don't see how you're going to do that with something that's fake.
Yeah. I think webinars will get kind of the position similar to all the in-person events and conferences, where this is where you truly build the human connection. Of course, in person is still different than a webinar. It's it's over camera.
Mm-hmm.
But if you build your presence on a webinar in the right way, you can get part of that human connection, which you never will be able to build in any AI generated content. I agree
Yeah,
with you. AI
100%.
is there, but yeah.
When we founded Contrast, people were of the opinion of webinars and companies like Hopin, they're completely going to replace physical events. Yeah, during COVID because we were all locked down. But after the lockdown, people couldn't wait fast enough to organize a new physical event. And here we are, it's 2025, and I still see, especially around the months of May and June, a record number of physical events, right? I see the same thing with AI. There's a place for everything. There's a place for webinar. The webinar industry didn't shrink because we went back to physical events. Not at all. But I also don't really feel that physical events have lost their plot right now. So I think everything will get its place, and we will coexist very neatly one next to the other. But in the end, we specialize in webinars. Physical events are different in that case, and AI will be different in that case as well. But there's no reason why one would kill the other.
Yeah. Where can people find you before we finally wrap up?
LinkedIn. I think that's the only social network that I have. So LinkedIn, yeah, feel free to connect with me. Happy to answer any HubSpot questions, webinar questions. And if you're really interested in a webinar platform, of course, I can recommend Contrast. But we actually have a very good overview of the entire market. Contrast is not always the right fit. We realize that, we understand that. So I'm always happy to just help and point people in the right direction.
Awesome. Luuk, thank you so much. I had a lot of
Cheers.
fun talking to you. We'll see you around. If nothing else, on the LinkedIn feed.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Take care.